By the summer of 1944, many American pilots believed the air war over Europe had already been decided. High above the continent, the sky felt owned. Bomber streams crossed Germany in daylight, escorted by long-range fighters that roamed almost at will. For crews flying out of England, the Luftwaffe no longer felt like an equal opponent. It felt exhausted, defeated, finished. But history, as it often does, was about to interrupt that certainty. Meanwhile, inside briefing rooms across southern England, U.S. Army Air Forces officers pointed to maps thick with red lines and arrows. Loss rates were down. Escort coverage was up. Veteran bomber crews spoke openly of survival in terms that would have sounded unthinkable just a year earlier. A tail gunner from AB-17 would later recall, "By late 44, we felt like the Germans had shot their last good pilots." According to historical records, that belief was not unreasonable. The Luftwaffe had been bleeding experienced airmen since 1943, especially after the introduction of the P-51 Mustang with drop tanks. But no one knew, at least not yet, that Germany had been quietly nurturing a weapon that did not fit the old rules of air combat. Deep inside the Reich, under camouflage nets and in dispersed factories, engineers were assembling the world's first operational jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262. It was faster than anything the Allies had ever flown. Not slightly faster, terrifyingly faster. On paper, it could outrun, outclimb, and disengage from every American escort fighter in the sky. To most Allied airmen, jets were still rumors. Intelligence reports mentioned rocket aircraft and unusual engine noise, but these were often dismissed as exaggerated battlefield chatter. After all, Germany was losing factories, fuel, and territory. The idea that they could suddenly leap into the future felt almost absurd. Then came the first encounters. In late 1944, bomber crews began reporting something strange.
Silver aircraft streaking past formations too fast to track. No propeller bluer. No classic attack pattern. Just a brief roar, different, deeper, and then gone.
Some gunners fired instinctively, convinced the enemy plane must be diving. But the airspeed didn't match a dive. According to post-mission reports, several crews initially believed they were witnessing optical illusions caused by stress and altitude. What happened next shocked both sides. A jet would slash through a bomber stream, fire a burst of 30mm cannon shells, and disappear before escorts could respond.
It wasn't a dogfight.
It was an interruption, violent, brief, and deeply unsettling. One B-24 pilot later described it as being passed on a highway by something from the next century. Yet even as fear crept back into Allied cockpits, confusion reigned. The jets did not appear in large numbers.
They did not stay.
And they did not seem able to stop the bombers outright. Behind the scenes, German jet pilots faced crippling limitations: fuel shortages, inexperienced ground crews, engines that flamed out without warning. As Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland would later admit, the aircraft had arrived with astonishing potential, and impossibly late. But in the air, perception mattered more than strategy. For American crews who thought the worst was behind them, the appearance of jets carried a chilling message: the enemy was not finished innovating. And if Germany could field even a handful of aircraft that no escort could catch, what else might still be waiting? As winter closed in over Europe, Allied pilots began to realize that air superiority did not mean invulnerability. The sky had shifted again, quietly suddenly, and the war was not done surprising anyone. By early 1945, Allied airmen had stopped calling the jet sightings rumors. They were real now, documented, sketched, debriefed, and quietly feared. Briefings included new warnings: watch the high six, expect extreme closing speeds, do not chase. The last instruction was the hardest to accept. Fighter pilots were trained to pursue, to turn aggression into control. But the jets could not be chased.
Not yet.
Meanwhile, German jet pilots were discovering that speed came with its own terrors.
The Messerschmitt Me-262 demanded careful hands and constant attention.
Engines were temperamental. Throttle changes had to be slow.
Fuel was scarce.
According to historical records, many sorties ended not in combat but in flameouts on approach, pilots gliding powerless toward damaged runways hunted by Allied fighters. What followed was a grim adaptation on both sides.
American pilots learned patience.
If they could not catch a jet at altitude, they would wait where jets were weakest, near the ground. Mustangs and Thunderbolts prowled near known jet bases, circling at the edges of flak belts, counting minutes. When jets returned low on fuel, heavy and slow, the future suddenly became mortal. The tactic worked. Jet losses on takeoff and landing mounted, and with them the realization that technology alone could not overturn a collapsing system. But inside bomber formations, the fear lingered. A jet attack was brief but unforgettable. Crews remembered the sound most of all: not the rattling approach of propellers, but a deep tearing roar that arrived and vanished in seconds. Gunners struggled to lead targets moving faster than instinct allowed. A navigator from the 8th Air Force later said, "It wasn't the damage that scared us. It was knowing we couldn't do anything about it." German leadership understood the irony too late. Jet pilots like Galland knew the aircraft should have been fielded in numbers, trained properly, used defensively. Instead, political interference, resource shortages, and time itself strangled the program. According to post-war testimony, some Luftwaffe officers privately admitted the jets proved Germany's engineers were still brilliant, just no longer decisive. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence raced to capture intact examples. Test pilots were eager. They wanted to feel the acceleration, to understand the machine that had unsettled bomber streams. When American and British pilots finally flew captured jets after the war, many were stunned. The performance was real. The threat had been real. But so had the limits. By the spring of 1945, the skies over Germany were crowded again, but this time with inevitability. Jets still appeared, still struck fast, still vanished. Yet they did not change the outcome. The bombers kept coming. The factories burned.
The fuel ran out. The pilots ran out.
For American airmen, the jets left a lasting impression, not of defeat, but of humility. The war they thought was ending had offered one final lesson: dominance is temporary, and innovation never stops at the moment you feel safest. As the last missions flew and surrender approached, some pilots looked back on those silver streaks with a strange respect. They had seen the future arrive in fragments, too late to save one side, just in time to warn the other. Because the next war, everyone sensed, would be faster. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, American pilots returned home with victory on their records, and unease in their memories. For many, the German jets lingered more vividly than flak bursts or dogfights. They had been brief encounters, almost footnotes in mission logs. Yet those moments had cracked something deeper: the belief that air superiority was permanent once achieved. In the months after surrender, Allied test pilots were given access to captured German technology. Among the most studied aircraft was the Messerschmitt Me 262. In hangars stripped of wartime urgency, pilots finally had time to examine what had once streaked past them like a rumor. According to historical flight test reports, the jet's acceleration was breathtaking. From takeoff to speed, it behaved unlike anything powered by a propeller. Controls felt different. Time itself felt compressed. One American test pilot reportedly remarked that flying it was like skipping several chapters of aviation history at once. But the deeper realization came not from speed, but from context. The jet was revolutionary and unfinished. Engines wore out after a handful of hours. Runways had to be long and intact. Maintenance demands were extreme. The aircraft that had terrified bomber crews could barely survive a war of attrition. It was, as one historian later described, a glimpse of the future trapped inside the ruins of the present. Meanwhile, the men who had flown against those jets reflected on what they represented. For bomber crews, the fear had never been about losses alone. It was about helplessness. Jets appeared where doctrine had no answer yet. For a few seconds, skill and experience meant nothing. That sensation stayed with them long after the war. Luftwaffe veterans, interviewed years later, spoke with a similar mix of pride and bitterness. Jet pilots knew they were flying history's first draft of a new age, but they also knew they were alone, unsupported by fuel, numbers, or time. According to post-war testimony, several admitted they understood, even as they flew, that the aircraft would not change Germany's fate. And that truth tied both sides together. The jets did not decide World War II, but they quietly decided what came next. Within months, American and British engineers were incorporating lessons learned from German designs.
Swept wings, jet propulsion.
New training philosophies. Air forces around the world began to shift their thinking, no longer measuring dominance by maneuver alone, but by speed, altitude, and technology cycles that moved faster than wars themselves. For the pilots who had seen jets flash past their formations in 1944 and 1945, the memory carried a warning. The enemy they thought was finished had reached forward into tomorrow. And next time, tomorrow might arrive earlier. Looking back, many American airmen described those encounters not as moments of defeat, but of awakening. The war had taught them how to win. The jets had taught them how quickly winning could change. As one veteran later said in an oral history interview, "We won the war with propellers. But we knew, the moment we saw those jets, that the next one wouldn't be fought the same way. The sky had spoken. And it was already moving on."